Okay, perfect. We have a big audience today, so I won't keep everyone waiting. Thank you everyone again for joining today's webinar. We have Ransom and Ryan today who will be presenting, and it will be a very lively discussion. So Ransom and Ryan, go ahead and turn on your webcams and microphone, and I will pass it off to Ransom to take it away.
Thank you, Elise. So my name is Ransom Hawley. I'm the CEO here at Caddle, and delighted to have Ryan Harris join us. So maybe I'll pass it over to Ryan for a quick intro.
Thanks, Ransom. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Ryan Harris. I'm a principal at IRI. I've been at IRI for about 5 years now. We operate primarily here in Canada in the retailer gateway space. And so I work kind of regularly with a lot of manufacturers and retailers, helping them drive value out of a lot of the retailer data that we work with.
Great, appreciate it. And thank you for the slide, Elise. Mine notably was taken before COVID, so if it looks like I've aged a bit, it's because of that. But also to set the tone, that we have a lot of great data here today. It's going to be discussion with Ryan, as well as covering the data that we've recently collected, as well as IRI had conducted a similar study in the US in January. So we've got some comparative results as well. But we're also going to have a little bit of fun, as we always do.
Yes. Okay. Yes, before we dive in, a couple of housekeeping things at the top. So first, like all of our webinars, this one will be recorded and the deck will be shared after the event. So definitely look out for that email. As well, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, there is a question panel that you should see on your screen. So feel free to submit any questions during the presentation and we will go through it at the very end. And then finally, if you have any questions that that are very data specific, we can't dig into that live. We will have our emails up on the screen at the very end as well, so you can reach out. Okay, back over to you.
Thanks, Elise. Okay, so we will spend only 2 slides talking about Caddle, and this is where we collected the data, and then in partnership with IRI, who helped to analyze the data, and we pulled it together in this deck that we have today, which, as Elise mentioned, we'll be sharing after the fact along with the recording. So Caddle is a mobile-first data and insights platform. We have our own first-party panel that we recruit and retain and engage, and we reward those Caddle members for sharing their data and engaging with brands. We are exclusively within Canada. About 1 in 2,500 Canadian adults uses the Caddle platform every single day, and it's a large and diverse panel as well, so we're able to collect a lot of data very quickly across the country. In terms of the methodology, I briefly touched on it. The study that we conducted just last month was just over 2,800 from a balanced panel within the Caddle platform, our first-party panel that I just referred to, and then the data that we're comparing it to is US data that was conducted earlier this year in January of a panel just over 1,000. In terms of the agenda that we have today, we talked about Caddle. That was it, painless. Many of you who are probably on the webinar have worked with us in the past, so you know us well, but I wanted to give some background there. Then we'll cover a few key areas and some supporting slides. We've got a few questions for Ryan and some very recent and interesting data given the environment that we're all living through right now and trying to learn through at the same time. So the first area we're covering is how rising prices are changing consumer behavior, then the impact of empty shelves, and then also looking at e-commerce as it saw a mass acceleration throughout COVID, but also some interesting dynamics within the Canadian market, especially as it relates to the US. And then finally, we'll cover off the key takeaways. So this data is it is a fairly high level, right? And there are, I know both Ryan and IRI and Caddle are working with clients individually to dig into data by specific categories. So we're looking at a very macro level trend data from a perspective of just the shopper in a grocery, not particular to any specific categories. Now you'll see things broken out, but as you look at this data, you'll probably say, well, it depends based on the category. And you're absolutely right, and we can certainly dig into that data further. But today we're trying to get a macro level view of the Canadian consumer and how these aforementioned issues are really changing behavior, which is really a once in a generation opportunity for brands to really capitalize. And my background before Caddle was working at SC Johnson, and you know, it was difficult, you know, to see low single percentage growth and really scraping for share wins. Of course, higher when I was on the desks. But this is, with great challenge and desperation, comes a lot of opportunity to both do well as a brand and do good at the same time, because there are pretty incredible pressures on the Canadian consumer that we see through our data that we wouldn't necessarily see in our day-to-day lives. So we've got you know, almost free money causing a ton of issues, which we're very recently seeing in things like the tech space and valuations, but also some runaway spending driving that inflation and the cost of gas, the cost of groceries. To live in Canada today versus, you know, 6 months ago or a year ago, you know, we're seeing inflation rates at a 31-year high. And you layer on top of that, 1 in 7 Canadian families has difficulty putting food on the table, food insecure, and about 50% of Canadians can't afford a $1,000 emergency. So these types of pressures Canadians are feeling, and it is driving real changing behavior. And so those are the things we're going to cover today. But really, the environment today is quite dynamic. And as I said, there's an opportunity for some significant gains if you're understanding your consumer and really sharpening your pencil in the right areas. Okay. Not surprisingly, I mean, almost every Canadian is feeling higher prices. We've got 71% of Canadians saying prices are much higher, and then 25% they're a little bit higher. So in totality, you know, 96% of Canadians are seeing higher prices, and that's perpetuated by the media as well. And also we're seeing increased inflation rates amongst staple items. So that kind of has a halo effect. But really, all Canadians are perceiving higher prices. And then we saw that because we've conducted studies like this in the past. We've seen that even before prices have really hit the shelf, as a lot of media indicated that this was coming. But now it's actually hitting the shelves, and now we're seeing these inflationary prices, whether it be driven by, you know, cheap money or the war in Ukraine. With gas, I mean, we're seeing these things as we're driving anywhere. These, you know, $2 for a liter of gas. So it's right in our face. So not surprising. And that was 90% in the US, but that was back in January. So even layering on a couple months, we're sure to see that increase. So fairly similar there. And then, you know, to help kind of dampen that, we're seeing the central bank having their most aggressive single rate adjustments in over 20 years. So, you know, there's help on the way, but a lot of the damage has already been done, and we're seeing that reflected at shelf, which is, again, a massive opportunity. So Ryan, on the right-hand side of this slide, there's some generational breakouts. And, you know, wondering if you have any thoughts on some of these certain generations and how it shakes out.
Yeah, thanks, Ransom. I think, you know, not overly surprising. We see kind of boomers, you know, and again, everyone's in this is their perception of how they're, you know, experiencing inflation. So it's not necessarily they're all equally impacted, obviously, by pricing. But boomers, we tend to see higher on the spectrum just because they're usually on fixed income, and usually fixed income, groups tend to experience inflation a lot harder than other groups. Millennials, from historically tend to have, less, dependencies and familial concerns. And so, although, again, they might be seeing the same price increases, their perception of it isn't as high. And so I think it's like you said, there's a lot hitting people from all different angles right now. And so each of these groups is kind of feeling it in different ways. And I am on calls a lot of the time, and just things that I think we look at, in the last relatively short period of 2 years, and we see these increases. But from a client perspective or CPG perspective, you've got categories where portability and people working from home now, and more and more. I think I saw a study in the US saying about 1/3 are going to work from home permanently, 1/3 are going to probably only do 2 or 3 days a week. While we think the pandemic is kind of temporary and it's going to go back to normal, there's going to be long-lasting effects. And I was on a call, I think not that long ago, talking about hairstyling, products, and just thinking about, the idea that people aren't, or makeup, people not getting up and going to the office and using products like that, or home meal replacements. And so really the dynamics, from a almost overarching perspective, but also into those groups, is going to have a profound impact going forward, even as we come out of the pandemic.
Yes, as these interest rates start to hit, I mean, I know a lot of us are looking around saying, how are these houses priced the way they are? How are people affording these mortgages? And as these interest rates go up, I mean, there could be a really long tail of these pinches that are being felt by more than just, the lower class who's struggling to make ends meet. Now, the other question I have for you here, Ryan, is we've seen fairly rapid inflation rates and things like gas spike in a relatively short period of time. Do you see Canadians just adjusting and settling to this new normal, or do you see more longer lasting consequences?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, we do see in some cases where consumers will have a knee-jerk or almost an emotional reaction to coming into a certain category. There's definitely, I was seeing something also out of the US that IRI had performed, talking about elasticities starting to rebound, price elasticity or sensitivity starting to rebound to pre-pandemic levels. So post-pandemic now they're starting to rebound to more normal levels. And so I think people are starting to become much more thrifty in terms of their shopping. I think once you have people that shift down to those brands, or they'll make adjustment or changes, and I think we talk a little bit about this in some other slides, I think there's always that perception of whether it's going to then, the next time they purchase it, the point of reference is going to be, what else on the shelf is also kind of similarly priced in terms of their reference points. Because as consumers shop, they tend to look at, sort of comparative references and sort of look at, what they can afford. I think some of the things you were touching upon, though, Ransom, just speaks to the overall affordability index of people having to make really hard choices in terms of, rising transport costs, what gas is costing, what housing prices is going for, interest rates increasing. It's really going to, precipitate a change in sort of behavior. And so one of the other things that's really interesting that I've kind of seen that's come out of the US too, is the idea that you start to see the mainstream get squeezed in the middle, and you start to see almost a super premium segment emerge, and then the value kind of segment grow. So it's almost as though consumers are trading down in value. And so marketers might say, oh, well, everyone, as price increases go up, everyone's just going to trade down and go to the bottom. What you actually start to see is that people, because they make sacrifices from an emotional perspective, they almost want to reward themselves. So the idea is, maybe I'll buy private label on certain products that I might have to sort of bite the bullet on, but I'm going to buy these super, premium bottle of wine because that's how I'm going to indulge myself or reward myself for making these kind of perceived sacrifices. And so it's interesting that you see kind of this polarization of, two sides of the equation. So definitely some interesting things going on as people start to rationalize their choices.
Interesting. Yeah, and we can jump to the next slide, Elise. Thank you. It reminds me of a trend that I saw that was surprisingly emerging throughout COVID, of perhaps treating yourself, and also a result of being in front of a camera was Brotox, the use of Botox amongst males, which perhaps that's a luxury that will continue in this post-COVID world.
Yeah,
but I will not confirm or deny that I've Botoxed. Okay, so in terms of all these things that are happening and shifting, and very interesting to note that kind of value and super premium as Canadians really are feeling the pinch and treat themselves. So when we're looking at what changes Canadian consumers are going to be making, so changing shopping choices recently. So again, this data was collected less than a month ago. 76%, 3/4 of Canadians said that they have changed shopping choices. And how that shakes out, you'll see 2 columns in the bottom left there. It's Canada and the US. And there are some fairly significant differences here. There is a little bit of difference in timing, but still, I don't think that that can be attributed to the gaps here. But in terms of the Canadian consumer, a lot more willingness to shift. 81% of Canadians will be looking for sales or deals more often, not very surprising. And as a Canadian consumer, we are more value conscious and buy more on deal. Cutting back on non-essentials. So well, we don't have what non-essentials are, and it is relative to each consumer in terms of what they deem essential. You know, for me, Brotox would absolutely be essential and non-essential. So we could certainly dig into that, and there are some clients that we're working with to understand, you know, where on this decision tree, where does their categories and their brands fall. But cutting back on non-essentials is key. I mean, exiting categories completely, at least for a short time. Switching to lower cost brands, not surprising, 1 in 2 of that 76%. So this list is of the 76%, which is still the majority. Switching to store brand and private label, 47%. Again, dependent on the category, but a large percentage of Canadians. And then lower cost retailers. So that one is a big one. I mean, we're not just talking about in store and shifting or perhaps online, actually seeking out lower cost retailers. And that one is a big one that jumps out versus the US, right? And that 11%. I've got some thoughts there, but would also love your thoughts, what that discrepancy is. But having 45%, so it's 45% of 76, right? So let's call that, you know, high 30s, 1 in 3 or greater are going to switch to lower cost retailers from where they're currently shopping for groceries, is massive. So from a retailer perspective, but also from a brand perspective, you know, that means differences in shopping behavior and potentially marketing and value promotional tactics. And then switching to larger packs. So it is a value play, but not necessarily, you know, buying the smaller pack, but potentially buying more, right? So from a value and from promotional tactic perspective, you know, we're seeing a lot of the buy X, save X. If you're buying, you know, 3, 4, 5 or more, you can save a little bit. So potential pantry loading as indicated here as well. So I'd love your thoughts on that one piece there, which is in Canada, we've got 45% of Canadians saying that they'll be switching to a lower cost retailer. Now, a lower cost retailer has a bit of a different definition in the minds of Canadians, perhaps than the minds of US folks. But any thoughts on that variance there, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, you know, historically, what I would say is that, you know, Canada probably has some of the nicest discount retailers probably in the world in terms of, you know, the way that they, you know, when we go into a Maxi or a Super C or an RCSS, what we kind of consider what Canadians kind of perceive as a discount retailer. In the US, I think they've made improvements, you know, just from my personal experience. They definitely, if you go back, say 15, 20 years, it was a different story. But I still think there's a difference in American perception in terms of when you think about low cost retailers. To them, I mean, they sell in some cases fresh fruit and produce at, you know, dollar stores, so, or Dollar General, and so you can get a whole different range of what's considered a low cost, you know, retailer for Americans. So I think that could be, a plate of it. And, part of it in here that you see when you're looking at the inflation aspect is a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're seeing a reduction, in the promo frequency. I've seen studies from the US and just from, anecdotal experience here in Canada, where I've seen clients have promo blackouts, but like the depth of discount has decreased, the promo frequency has decreased, and the lifts are starting to be even lower. So, what we're seeing is, kind of it's a twofold effect. And when you're looking at people that are saying they're looking for more deals and deals more often, I think it's really going to be challenging for, a lot of retailers and, suppliers to start offering those like kind of creative value propositions to consumers, because we're already at a level where I see categories sometimes that are 60-70% sold on, on promo. And so it's like, where do you go from there? And it really is a challenging and kind of daunting, kind of idea that people are going to be even seeking more deals. So I think it is going to be kind of up to the market to sort of offer, and that's what you start to see is more creative offers where they can add value in different ways, whether it's with loyalty points or whether it's with some type of bundling offer across promotions, as opposed to just like, hey, it's 15% off now or 20% off the regular price. That seems to be where a lot of questions that I'm getting, that I'm working with is, how can we better look at our promotional efficiency and look at our calendar and say, where can we really, pick those areas that we have a low subsidy rate and where we can really gain value from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think there's some potential upside gain from also looking back to 2008, 2009, previous recession when consumers felt squeezed. I remember seeing data that there's a halo effect of these decisions that consumers are making at the grocery store. So if you think about switching to something that is more processed or frozen, and how that impacts your body, and the need for more heartburn medication, or there was a growth in laxatives as well because of the result of eating this different food that is perhaps more processed. So as a brand and retailer, there's the immediate shifts that I'm making. Then there's also the kind of fallout of that and the products that I'll be buying as a result of these purchases that I'm making. So I think people probably see something similar that we saw as a result of the 2008, 2009 recession. Okay, so last question on this slide. What implications does this have to conventional and discount retailers? And so if I'm a conventional retailer and I'm seeing this 45% switching to lower cost retailers, so giant opportunity for discount retailers to capture that and capture more than their fair share of that, and kind of be the white knight for Canadians to help them save money. But what can they do to retain shoppers from a conventional perspective, and perhaps your perspective on discount as well?
Yeah, it's a really, really challenging thing, and it's something that we work with on a regular basis, is looking at, kind of the loyalty retention and how well, sort of those, loyal cardholders are doing in different retailers we work with. And I think it really comes down to, the value and experience. And I was at the Seattle conference, which is the big CPG conference here in Montreal, just recently, and there was a podcast, a seminar, and she was talking about, how, even the podcast, the sounds, like kind of the experience of going into the grocery store and the fresh, kind of smell of the bakery and the sounds and all these kind of things that are the sort of community environment, in terms of destination. And I think, you see where Whole Foods is kind of, turned almost, their grocery stores into a meeting center and a shopping area where there's fresh dining involved, and anything that they can do to sort of attract and, kind of enhance that experience. I think from you saw during the pandemic that when sort of, the priorities change for consumers, conventional, retailers tend to perform better than discount retailers. Well, that really speaks to, on a priority level where consumers are really placing their, their importance in terms of, I want to go somewhere that I trust in terms. And so I think those attributes need to be reinforced, to consumers in terms of the reasons why they went there in the first place. And although the pandemic is kind of, now sort of, sort of fizzling out, if that's the right word to use, I think it's still more important than ever that they really, hit on those key points as to why people make the decision to come there in the first place. And so you saw a huge upsurge, just from our data and information that showed that more people were switching away from discount to conventional, mainly because they felt, the experience and the environment was safer, in that pandemic. So I think it's something that they need to reinforce.
Mm-hmm. And we have a quarterly bricks and mortar customer experience tracker and an e-com customer experience tracker focused in grocery. And what we see is that Costco, not surprisingly, best in class net promoter score, Giant Tiger, Sobeys, and Shoppers Drug Mart. And for different reasons, with the pandemic, but that experience, it still lended to be quite sticky from specific consumer perspectives. So strong customer experience, as you had alluded to, drives that loyalty, which can hopefully retain them. But I think there's also ways, in this slide, we're seeing Canadians looking for larger packs and more value, right? So necessarily helping consumers by pantry loading, which we got a crash course in that at the beginning of the pandemic. But so there's different levers that Canadians are looking to pull. And as you kind of slice and dice the data and look at this consumer panel by generation, by gender, by household income, ethnicity, by location, you can get an idea of maybe how you adapt these different tactics across the country as you understand your consumer.
Yep, 100%.
Okay, so most recently, empty shelves, which is the next slide, which we are all, I'm sure, seeing and feeling, whether you are going in store or if you're 1 in 10 Canadians that uses Instacart, or perhaps the 40% of Canadians, 41% plus of Canadians that are Amazon Prime members, of which 25% are subscribe and save members, which means they subscribe to at least one product on an ongoing basis. It's interesting because there's the physical at store, then there's the Instacart piece where it's driving forced trial for consumers depending on their decision tree of, okay, my preferred brand product isn't here. Do I buy a different brand in this category? Do I not purchase it at all? And so there's some data here. And then there's, so it's driving forced trial, which is an opportunity for arguably perhaps the ill-prepared. I mean, the most efficient and lean supply chain models, most sophisticated, are arguably the most impacted of this, right? If perhaps you didn't have the most sophisticated supply chain and maybe had larger stock, you may have disproportionately benefited from something like this. And then there's the Instacart piece, and I don't know if you've noticed that on Amazon, for the things that you order and subscribe and save, they've recently introduced a substitute where you can select different substitutes that wasn't there in the past because of supply chain issues. So there are things that are the consumers are both being, I am empowering the shopper from an Instacart perspective to substitute for me, or I'm selecting a different substitute. So potential wealth of data there and opportunity for newer fighter SKUs. Anyway, so out of stocks have been noticed in Canada, specifically in the past 3 months. That's not surprising. 3/4 of Canadians have personally experienced out of stocks. Now, Ryan, there's another breakout here by generation, and a question for you. So why do you see the disparity in perceived availability of products between different generational groups, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's more hypothesis because we don't really have hard data on this, but I mean, generally speaking, boomers tend to be a little bit more routine oriented. They tend to be a little bit more kind of habitual in terms of their purchase habits. And so, you know, their perception might be, you know, that when they see stuff out of stock, they answer questions in terms of seeing stuff. Millennials, you know, you know, tend to be a little bit more open to trying new items or switching or moving around as they're sort of forming their habits and their band preferences. So I mean, it goes back to the loyalty, kind of hard established loyalty. And I guess, you know, when you perceive an out of stock, it's when you can't find what you're looking for. For some people, that means brand. For some people, that means just the category is not available, right? So as long as you had a peanut butter or a ketchup, or that's not out of stock for me. So I think that's important that we kind of differentiate the question. But I think it does speak to the generational differences for sure. But it's just staggering when you look at the number, like 76%. I mean, like if you go back, like I can't remember even going back 5-10 years, like what it used to be at, but it was maybe in the 20s or something, you know, in terms of, you know, finding out of stocks. And 76%, I mean, it's monumental, you know, kind of, you know, challenges that, you know, we're facing at retail right now. And it's not like you go, like, you know, when we have a kind of natural disasters where the whole shelf is out for days and days and days, like we saw during the pandemic. But periodically, you know, I think we lived in a world where we just had excessive, you know, kind of supply, and we always became accustomed as consumers to getting whatever we wanted when we wanted. And now we have to deal with that periodic kind of, you know, pain in the rear end where, you know, we're not going to have what we're looking for. And I think that's going to change a lot of purchase behavior for sure.
Yes, and we avoid sample sizes of one here at Caddle, but I think about some personal out of stock. While it's a challenge, it's also an opportunity. And I've got 3 little kids, and there was an example where in store we substituted from a typical product that we buy. It was a cereal, and it turned out to be, you know, the kids' favorite. So it's now become a staple. So that forced trial has driven a staple. And then there's a couple examples where through Instacart, there's been a substitute, unbeknownst to me, delivered, some good, but some bad, that have actually become staples, right? That I wouldn't deviate from my purchases, and you know, God forbid I get the cereal that my kids don't want at that time, right? But you try that, and suddenly there's new behaviors that are sticking. So certainly some will go back, but this forced trial, because of this monumental number, as you mentioned, is an opportunity. And, you know, trying to identify, well, how do we take those accidental opportunities and make them, you know, more concerted efforts to drive this forced trial? There's a few potential opportunities by working with some of these e-com providers, and also some tactics in store. So on the next slide, we alluded a little bit to this, but so products are out of stock, and what does that mean? What consumer behavior does that drive? 65% of Canadians said that they've changed their shopping habits as a result of out of stocks in the past 3 months. You'll see the difference here on the bottom left between Canada and the US. Less of a variance to what we saw on slide 7 a few slides back. But what we see is that 1 in 3 Canadians just forego the purchase. So from a retailer and a brand perspective, you know, they're, depending on the category, that's a sale that's leaving the store and leaving that category. And 60% buy it elsewhere. So if it's a sum of a few of these numbers, they went to a different store, or they went online, or they went elsewhere. So Ryan, I've got a couple thoughts, as well as a couple questions for you on this one. But there is, you know, we've done Instacart and Amazon webinars, and we've got quarterly trackers for both in the Canadian market. And what we've seen is that there are, while the adoption of Instacart is still strong, 10+% of Canadians using the platform, there's another wave of that coming within grocery through platforms like Uber Eats and DoorDash and Skip the Dishes, as well as Instacart expanding to new retailers like the LCBO, Giant Tiger, the pilot with Dollarama was expanded. So more reasons for people to use these platforms. So we fully expect the 1 in 10 Canadians using Instacart, we expect that to grow, but also that percentage as most of us have an Uber Eats, a Skip the Dishes, or DoorDash on our phone. So it's an easy extension to start using that. So it'll be interesting for us to see how those substitutions come into play as they're either pre-selected or forced by the shopper. But there's certainly an opportunity as this number starts to accelerate from a brand and a retailer perspective to drive that a trial and that opportunity, because there are opportunities like sponsored things when consumers are shopping.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we kind of see, and my experience anecdotally with one client was they always saw opportunities like this. They would call them disruptions or disruptions in market, and in their case, it was in a heavily regulated market, and they felt like their edge as a supplier or manufacturer in the industry was being better than their competitors at adapting to these disruptions so that they could take advantage. And so I think it definitely creates the opportunity where you can capitalize on these occasions to potentially position your brand in a different way, that you have consumers that for so long kind of walk through a door, or whether they go on Instacart or whether they're shopping on an online e-com platform, and autonomically going to the product they always use. Now you're dealing with a situation where, to your point, they're having forced trial, and so they're thinking about, okay, well, what are my alternatives, and do I want to select an alternative? And so I think while a lot of the suppliers I'm working with are kind of scrambling to make sure they have their own sort of house in order and are supplying their demand, I think they also need to be having their headspace into how can we capitalize on this kind of unique moment in time where somebody's walked in and bought the same peanut butter or ketchup or whatever for the last say 50 years. How do I get them to consider, well, maybe if that's not available, maybe I can buy something that's a possible substitute. So I think it definitely lends itself to that. I think there's definitely a component that in some cases some of them are temporary, like cereal. There was a strike, I think, in the US. It's kind of lends itself to some of the shortages we're seeing there. But it's something that right now I think the old-fashioned way is we're really working closely with ever since this has started in the last, say, 6 months, where the supply shortages have really started to take hold. We're working quite closely with a lot of supplier partners and their retailers, working together with data that's lagged on a 24-hour level, just monitoring inventory levels, their promotional planning, their forecast out, making sure they meet demand. So they're really doing it the kind of keeping all eyes on deck type thing to make sure that they've got enough inventory to meet demand.
Right. And what are some strategies both retailers and suppliers? What are some that you think they can use to really get ahead of these challenges and also capitalize on something like this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think from an assortment perspective, I had a client that I was dealing with out in eastern Canada that had just basically had major labor shortages, just couldn't fulfill a plan. I mean, I think the plant was from say 300-400 people down to 150. And they had kind of voluntarily gone through and I think analyzed their portfolio and said, you know what, we can afford to make all these products because they don't yield the return that we're getting. So I think in a lot of cases you're seeing kind of manufacturers go back and say, do I need all these products? Are they really essential to my portfolio? Can we put more facings of a particular product on shelf to maximize our portfolio? I think the other side of it is you're seeing promo blackouts, and kind of what I spoke to in the US. You're seeing the effect of that because a lot of manufacturer clients just can't satisfy the demand with the promos that they've got on schedule. So they're basically going through their promotional calendar and saying, okay, well, what can we cut out and what can we actually do, because we can't sustain the lift of doing a 2-for-1 or a 25% discount. And so I think in terms of that, getting out ahead of those two things in terms of effectively planning for promotions and assortment optimization to streamline your portfolio or even production facility. The other thing I would say is in some cases it's looking at just in the longer term side is either right size packaging or looking at where can we potentially make products that are basically going to accommodate in terms of the inflationary impact that we're seeing, so that the cost, because as consumers start to trade down and start to move away, we're also going to have to start to see them being able to absorb that from a cost perspective as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, the last section of the deck is focusing on e-com, which we've talked a little bit about throughout so far, and then we'll get to key takeaways. So the question is, to what degree will the shift in e-commerce be sustained post-pandemic? And while there are a lot of Canadians, using different stages of e-com, whether it be delivery to home or click and collect, there has been a mass acceleration of e-com adoption. Still, the majority of Canadians are enjoying and continue to shop in store and bricks and mortar, and that's not to say. So the inverse of the numbers is still a large and rapidly growing number. As mentioned with our Instacart and Amazon trackers, we're seeing, let's call it the canary in the coal mine as for food delivery, grocery delivery platforms, some of the behemoths and heavily funded behemoths are entering the space outside of just restaurants. So that is coming. And by the way, if you are a larger brand with potentially larger household penetration or larger market share, it lends to more repeat habitual purchases, because those types of platforms remember your orders to make it easier and more convenient for you to shop. So less of an opportunity to bump into another product. It still happens on those platforms, but if you're a user of Instacart or those types of platforms, you'll see when you go back and shop it and go back on that platform and shop, you're prompted to really select what you've typically shopped to make it easier and more convenient and faster for you. You'll layer on top of that Amazon. So as I mentioned, 41% are Prime members. A quarter of those members are Subscribe and Save members. That Subscribe and Save adoption, which is you can save up to 20% on diapers, and up to 15% on if you subscribe to 5 or more items. So it really encourages you to grab the staples like toothpaste and toilet paper and health supplements, things that you're really buying on a regular basis, and then you save, and it's convenient, it's delivered right to your door. Those types of platforms with those pressures, and I'll touch a little bit more on Amazon in a second, but also you think about now it costing a lot more for you to travel to the store. So some of the objections to using those platforms in the past, and we're keeping a close eye on it, has been it's expensive, it's too costly. Whether it be a Prime membership, which is gaining, well, they're seeing a price increase, but it's gaining more and more value, especially with the $8-point-something billion acquisition of MGM. So your Prime membership gets you access to Prime or Amazon Music and Prime Video and all these things. So there's more value being built in there. And on top of that, it potentially being more expensive to leave, so more of an incentive for consumers to buy. But on the Amazon piece, you've got a quarter of people that are using Subscribe and Save. A significant percentage, I think it's 35% of those shoppers, have really entered that Subscribe and Save in the past 12 to 24 months, and they're trialing it. So they've got a handful of products. They're seeing that 15%. What we see historically with Subscribe and Save is very sticky, and Amazon does a great job at encouraging you to layer more and more onto that. And as you start to receive these packages and those 15% savings on a monthly or bi-monthly basis or longer, it's a very sticky behavior. And from our quarterly trackers, the consumers that are currently light Subscribe and Save users intend to use it a lot more, and even post-pandemic. So we're not necessarily seeing that full impact today because they're lightly using Subscribe and Save, but there's a giant group of consumers that have trialed it. So that's going to continue to snowball as they add more and more to that basket. So it's a unique time, and I still think we're looking at the tip of the iceberg here from those dynamics with the players in the market between delivery, Instacart, Uber Eats, DoorDash, as well as Amazon. Okay. Yeah. You had something you want to share there, Ryan?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's interesting. I didn't know those numbers with the Subscribe and Save, so it's interesting to hear from an Amazon. I think a lot of times what we're looking at, when you look at the stats on Canadians online kind of e-commerce outside of grocery kind of habits and expenditures, it's actually quite high and on par with a lot of the stuff that you see in the US. It's really when it comes down to grocery that there really is kind of the mystery of the question. And I think when you look at the the generations that are impacted here, the idea that they're equally impacted is kind of what I found interesting, because it kind of relates back to, I don't know if from a grocery perspective on e-com, like they've really fully communicated the value proposition to consumers, and as well as say Amazon or some of the ones you were talking about were, and I think when you look at that, baby boomers from a technological or being more technologically inclined are probably less to use those platforms, but from a need state perspective, they probably need them more from mobility concerns, safety, all the other kind of aspects we've seen. Whereas millennials, it's almost a whole different proposition for them when you look at online shopping. It's about convenience, the fingertip kind of generation of here and now. And every time I go to buy something at a restaurant, I'm behind 7 Uber Eats guys, because obviously they're buying it and they're asking for kind of immediate service right away. And so when you look at some of the challenges that I think e-com needs to overcome in Canada to kind of continue to grow and catch up to the US, it's addressing some of these kind of generational differences that we see in terms of the value proposition for each group.
Yes, agreed. Okay, couple questions here. You've covered a bit of it. Now while there has been a massive acceleration of e-commerce, we are still lagging behind the US. But COVID still hasn't really brought Canadians up to US standards, some of the other markets that are more advanced. What will, do you think, if anything, drive that sort of adoption that we see in the US and other markets in Asia?
Yeah, I think we could probably go to the next slide, at least, because this is kind of what this kind of deals, I think, with things. Yeah, so I think we'd asked in the US, and I mean, one of the big things that came out with delivery fees, but I really look at it from, when you ask around or you talk to different people and you go on different platforms, whether you've used them or not, it really comes down to, I think, the friction that's kind of involved in the e-commerce. There's still a certain degree, and obviously there's friction in getting out of your house and going to a grocery store, and that's the major inconvenience of doing it. We're talking about the experience kind of attributes that consumers seek into it. But I think there's still a lot of points of friction that I don't think they've fully removed out of the e-com process to catch up in the States. And I mean, when you look at, like, you were talking about substitutions in terms of, it can sometimes be like unbeknownst to you, they're substituting products. Well, that's kind of a friction point for consumers, right? Or having to set up a profile, or what do you substitute? I may want to substitute one category, but I may not want to substitute another. So the easier you can make it and more streamlined and getting what you want. Scheduling window. So, I don't want my milk, like, speaking about Uber Eats, kind of, I want it now and in an hour. I don't need my milk in 2 days. I need it like today and in an hour type thing. So how can you facilitate that for certain? And they're willing to pay for it in some cases. So I think, but that's a big part of it. I think, I was on a site the other day and talking about freshness in terms of guarantees, right? And they were saying, if any of the product, it was a particular retailer in Canada saying, well, if you're not satisfied with the freshness of your particular product, you can just come back and return it at store within 14 days. And it's kind of like, well, why am I going to go back to the store if I'm ordering online? That was the whole purpose of not going to the store, right? So, and I mean, they don't have the scale like of Amazon, but just to give you like a contrast that to Amazon, I can buy things on Amazon now, and not only do I not have to return it through a postage carrier, I can print a form, stick it in my mailbox, and they'll come on the delivery route and pick it up on their way back. Right. And so you can see they're actively trying to take out all the points of friction and make it easier and easier. And obviously, on a scale perspective, they're not looking to increase their number of returns. They're obviously looking to remove all those barriers to people say, well, I'm not going to buy it because it's a hassle to do this or to do that. And I think, e-com and grocery, and I don't know what the sort of the financials are around the, sort of the cost and scale for them to do that. But I think when you look at Amazon, that's the scale that's required to make it so easy to your point of subscribe and save, that it basically becomes, second nature for people to buy online.
Yeah, I recently demoed that Amazon, where I don't have to find my way to a Pure Later or to a Canada Post, put it in a box, tape it up, get the printed thing on top of it. You actually don't even need a printer in this new model. You just you put it outside, and it was a little bit clunky because they were figuring out as we were, but they came and picked up the items. So it was incredibly easy. And it was surprising to me that they were looking to make that easier, because I thought it was a great tactic where I just sit on the product because I just don't have time to go back to a Canada Post or something. But a really aggressive play, and now it removes almost any barrier where I know I can easily return it by just leaving it on my front step.
Yep.
So there's also with e-com, there's the impulse component, right? And whether it be shopping with kids, and to avoid a tantrum in store, you grab the items and give them to them, or you think about something like Costco, where us shopping online through Instacart for Costco probably saves us half the amount of money on these things that we wouldn't typically buy, whether it be clothes or these, new and fun snacks or something, or a $400 outside heater that we didn't know we needed. So how do you think these types of impulse components, especially if you're a brand in this type of play, how do you think that can be replicated online?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've actually heard people say that they prefer shopping online, because it saves them money, because they don't end up, if, like you said, buying the chocolate or ice cream for the temper tantrum, say 3-year-old. But I think from a retailer perspective, we're increasing that overall basket size, which is part and parcel of what I deal with on a regular basis, is manufacturers and retailers trying to work together to see how they can obviously increase the basket size for consumers when in store. I think online still has some catching up to do in terms of, number one, I think the visual aspect of like going in and manually searching. I think when and you have like certain staples that you're looking for, that obviously is fairly easy to do online. I still think the planogram, and when you walk in front of a shelf set, you kind of rationalize your choices and make impulse purchases, and you might pick up a different flavor, a different size that you see. That's really eliminated from online, and I think they need to start looking at how they replicate that component of saying, like, making those offers available. I think also when you look at Amazon and just speaking to some of the retailers who do it best, they're very good about complimentary offers. And you buy this, and if it's like you buy soft drink, well, did you consider potato chips? And what about, you need some dip for the potato chips, and then you need all those kind of complimentary items that sort of go along and build the basket where people kind of don't think of it. I don't think I see in Canada, at least, and it will differ depending on each online retailer, but I'm not seeing the same development in terms of making sure that they're providing other options. Like you do see in Amazon, quite frequently when you buy something, it's like, have you considered this? Have you considered this size or this color?
Yes.
I was joking the other day with my team that like when you're on my side, like when you find a pair of pants that you like, and they fit you, you buy like 4 colors of the same size, right? So it's the same kind of concept of making sure that you do that same kind of philosophy in terms of something that you like, and you reinforce and you complement with a purchase.
Right. I'm convinced that that the gauntlet that you have to run to get to the till, right, is they made it just narrow enough that children can reach either side of the shelf, right, to get the Kinder Egg or the chocolate bar, those types of things. But yeah, and on platforms like Instacart, or whether it be recommendations, they've recently allowed brands to sponsor certain items so they show up at the top of a category, or as you're about to check out, they recommend things like, what about this, which from what I've noticed isn't in my necessarily in my typical basket. So there are ways for brands to still be impulse by investing in some of those tactics on the platforms.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, well, looks like we're right on time here, and we'll just quickly cover these key takeaways, and then have a couple minutes for questions. Our contact information will also be on here as well, if you'd like to reach out to us or maybe have some more targeted questions. First is, it really is the perfect storm, as we talked about, with inflation rates, gas prices, the COVID pinch that many Canadians felt financially is driving these, I think the right word is monumental, Ryan, these changes, those percentages that we're seeing of Canadians who are looking for deals, going to change the physical location of where they shop. And layer on top of that some of the e-com conveniences, and now potentially from a value perspective, making sense versus traveling to the store and removing friction points. So a huge opportunity for brands that are well prepared, and really means now more than ever, brands need to intimately understand their consumer, and do so frequently. And we have a handful of trackers with clients that are looking at, as I know you do too, they're looking at these changes over a certain cadence, whether it be monthly or quarterly, to make sure that they're understanding these changing behaviors and adjusting accordingly. Getting creative with value, and you touched a little bit on this, Ryan, in terms of the tactics that you can use, but understanding that Canadians are feeling the pinch, but 45%, I believe the number was 45% would buy bigger and pantry load. So those multi-buy types of things that are going to potentially smooth out that promotional curve of these potentially giant spikes when things are going on sale or a deep discount. So there are a number of different things that levers that brands can pull, which doesn't necessarily mean the very bottom dollar, but providing everyday value, which may help them from a predictive perspective a little bit better. And by doing this, you're able to both do well as a brand and as mentioned earlier, do good from a Canadian perspective. Filling the shelves at all costs. I mean, we know it's easier said than done. At shelf is critically important. It's driving things like forced trial, which is potentially sticky depending on what they try, but also understanding that 60% of shoppers will go elsewhere. So there's a degree of stickiness, but from a retail perspective, that's a challenge, or potentially moving outside of their desired category or brand to try something new.
And just to build on that, Ransom, we do a lot of substitutability scenarios like in our data with retailers, and you'd be surprised that even though consumers are very habitual in their nature, there's high levels of substitutability in a lot of cases when retailers decide to go exclusive or they decide to remove a brand. You'd be shocked sometimes at how much of that volume is transferable. So it should concern manufacturers when they actually have these systemic out of stocks that although they have a large market share, it's not necessarily as secure as it may seem sometimes. Yes,
and I think Instacart is sitting on a gold mine of that data, which I haven't seen. They're a client of ours, but in terms of what consumers are selecting, in terms of, okay, if this isn't available, I'll take this instead. So that might be an area where you can really dig into that data as well. Yep. And in the last couple of minutes we've got left, we talked about a one-size-fits-all strategy, which ties into understanding your consumer intimately and making sure that you're tailoring those, which can be even more tailored in the digital environment through platforms like Instacart and the up-and-coming grocery delivery through Uber Eats, DoorDash, as well as Amazon. And finally, that links into our last point, e-com. Well, the numbers are still quite small, and behind the US, we see them rapidly growing from all of the environmental changes that we're seeing, from gas prices to removing friction to increasing value, and the adoption of easy things like subscribe and save to offer convenience. Anything you'd like to add, Ryan?
No, I think you summarized it well. I think it's definitely like I said, like we said at the beginning, it's definitely a pretty dynamic time, and I mean a lot of stuff kind of hitting people and consumers, challenging, interesting from a market research perspective because there's so much occurring at the same time, but obviously very challenging for retailers and suppliers alike.
Perfect. So our next webinar is a cannabis webinar working with Environics Analytics. That's on May 17th. If you go to askcaddle.com/events, you can register there. And then if you jump down to the next slide, you've got the contact information for myself and Mr. Harris, if you'd like to reach out to us, if you have any questions, anything. And we'll also go through some of the questions that were asked and can review those and potentially send out some responses in the follow-up email as well. So I want to thank everyone. I think Elise will jump on in a second, but I want to thank everyone for attending. This, I think, was our biggest webinar ever. Might be related to you, Ryan. I'm not sure, but we could say that. If I'm the staple and you're the variable, then it really must be due to you.
I appreciate it.
So thanks for attending. Thanks for all the great insights and information that you were able to share today, and also for your part in helping to craft and build this.
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Ransom, both for a great presentation. I know we went right up to the end there, so unfortunately we can't go through any questions, but like Ransom said, our team will follow up. We have your questions in the question panel, so one of our members will reach out. Again, this webinar and the deck will be shared to all of you, so definitely look out for that email later this week, and hopefully we see you at our next webinar. Thank you everyone so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.